honest with you, I'm disgusted. I'm disgusted with Sue Bird.
This is what we want. Instead, we're still getting bullshit on viewers.
ESPN. So because I work at my day job on ESPN, I'm supposed to ignore the fact?
Yeah, that's where these viewership numbers are coming. Yeah, it's a business you're in. It's not that they can't. And by the way, it's not that they can't be critical of certain things. They can have their opinions. But that's where I don't understand.
Kudos to her. She has elevated an entire sport.
They wanted her to stay quiet, stick to the script, play the game, and smile when the cameras came on. But Caitlin Clark finally spoke up, and what came out cracked open the real power dynamics running women's basketball. Behind the scenes, away from the box scores and highlight reels, there's a real battle happening. It's not on the hardwood. It's in executive offices, media circles, podcast studios, and tightly managed narratives that quietly decide who gets pushed forward and who gets erased before their story even starts. Caitlin Clark didn't just enter that system, she disrupted it. And that's exactly why she became a problem. When one player brings in millions of new fans to a league that struggled to fill seats not long ago, when she shatters attendance records, TV numbers, and engagement across every platform that matters, logic says she should be protected and celebrated.
And with Shannon, there's an aspect of them like defending their stances on her. Like, we were right about Caitlin and this is our defense. And I still think there's something twisted there because nobody ever said that Caitlin wasn't going to be a marketing.
That's not what happened. Instead, Clark took contact night after night, elbows, shoves, cheap shots, while the same voices that usually shout about safety suddenly went quiet. Not by accident, by design. Sue Bird sees the landscape clearly. A respected legend, a trusted media figure, someone whose words carry weight, and she's made her position obvious. Paige Bueckers is framed as the future, the polished face, the safer choice for the league's next era.
Let's look right here. Let's start right here. Let's look at the title. Let's look at the title alone. Team USA 2028 forecast. Paige Bueckers and the young stars on the rise. Oh, so this is the Paige Bueckers show. Oh, so y'all, when we went over that article, when they were saying that y'all were trying to make this Paige's USA team, look at this here. Team USA forecast, Paige Bueckers and the young star.
Clark, meanwhile, gets painted as a distraction, too bold, too confident, too uncontrollable for the image they spent years crafting. What they didn't anticipate is that Caitlin Clark doesn't need approval from the top. She already has something stronger. Packed arenas, non-stop viral moments, and kids everywhere pulling up from deep because they watched number 22 do it first. That's not a storyline you can tweak or clean up. It's a movement, and movements don't wait around for approval. Sue Bird has been signaling this for months, not loudly, but consistently. On podcasts, in interviews, on panels, the praise always lands on the same type of players. The ones who move the ball, stay within the system, and mirror the style of basketball she grew up respecting and promoting.
Caitlin, you're gonna have to wake up and smell the coffee. Sue Bird does not rock with you the way you think she does. Sue Bird absolutely plays Caitlin Clark again today. It is happening over and over and over to the point she made this entire USA thing about Paige Bueckers, talking about Paige Bueckers is the leader of the young crew that includes Caitlin Clark. They don't even put Caitlin Clark in none of the damn graphics on the show. She not putting in the time. It's all Paige Bueckers. This is crazy. This, Caitlin, you gotta see what's going on.
Caitlin Clark's name rarely comes up, and when it does, there's always a pause attached to it. A reminder that stats don't tell the full story, that basketball is deeper than highlights and buzz. That argument used to matter. It doesn't anymore. In today's game, attention drives everything. Visibility keeps leagues alive. And right now, Clark is the only player cutting through the noise and pulling in people who were never part of the core audience. The league's power structure knows this. The numbers don't lie. Ticket sales, TV ratings, social engagement all jump the moment she steps on the floor. But acknowledging that means admitting they misread the moment, misread the fans, misjudged who actually moves the culture forward. So instead of embracing what's happening, a different approach took over. Quiet resistance. Not loud pushback, but calculated restraint. It shows up in who gets highlighted, who gets ignored, Which narratives get airtime and which ones quietly fade away under talk about tradition and playing the right way? Clark noticed all of it. Every omission, every sidelined moment, every time her record-breaking nights were treated like background noise while other stories took center stage. She stayed locked in, let her play, do the talking until something finally tipped the balance. Maybe it was watching another player get praised for momentum she helped create. Maybe it was realizing that staying quiet wasn't shielding her at all. It was just making it easier for others to slowly erase her role. Whatever flipped the switch, Caitlin Clark reached a point where following their rules stopped making sense. What she shared privately, in conversations that are now leaking through unguarded moments and loose lips, is pulling back the curtain on how the entire system really works. The WNBA is standing at a fork in the road. One direction points straight toward growth, relevance, and a future the fans are already leaning into. The other heads back toward comfort, control, and a version of the game that feels safe to insiders but barely registers outside their bubble. Sue Bird is standing at that same intersection, and her position is no longer unclear. The real question now is what happens when the player they tried to marginalize becomes impossible to sideline. That turning point came during a meeting 3 weeks earlier. No cameras, no press statements, just a closed-door discussion that quietly shapes careers while the public stays in the dark. Caitlin Clark walked in expecting talk about Team USA, international competition, and how she fit into long-term plans. What unfolded instead felt like a lesson in institutional dismissal. Around the table sat the gatekeepers of the league, former champions, media executives, committee members whose influence stretches into every major decision. Sue Bird was among them, her presence carrying weight far beyond any title. Clark didn't need to posture or over-explain. The numbers did the work for her. Attendance jumped by nearly half in cities she played. Broadcast ratings shattered expectations so completely the benchmarks had to be rewritten. Merchandise sales eclipsed the rest of the league combined. She didn't show up demanding praise or special treatment. She showed up with proof, and that made the room uncomfortable. She came armed with facts, and the temperature in the room dropped fast. Because there's one truth nobody in power wants to say out loud. Caitlin Clark's success isn't just impressive, it's an indictment. Every sold-out arena is a quiet admission that the old approach wasn't working. Every viral clip is proof that the tightly controlled, system-first media strategy the league leaned on for years left massive audiences untouched.
There is a Caitlin Clark effect on all of basketball, and especially on women's basketball ratings. Kudos to her. She has elevated an entire sport.
Her presence challenges the foundation many of them built their reputations on. So when Sue Bird spoke, it wasn't aggressive. It was colder than that. It was dismissal disguised as guidance. The kind of feedback that sounds thoughtful on the surface but shuts doors underneath. The message was framed around bigger ideas, sustainability, culture, and responsibility, all while subtly placing limits on who gets to shine and how. Clark listened as the conversation shifted toward how players should represent the game, how visibility needs to be managed, how influence comes with expectations. The subtext was clear enough. You're doing too much. Pull it back. Fall in line. She stayed composed, nodded, kept it professional, thanked everyone, and walked out fully aware of what that meeting actually meant. Not a conversation. A rejection delivered face to face. But this is where it flipped. Caitlin Clark didn't fold. She didn't water down her game or soften her edge to match someone else's comfort zone. She doubled down. The very next night, she exploded for 38 points, buried 7 deep threes, jawed back at defenders who thought the moment might shrink her, and celebrated every bucket like it mattered more than ever. The building was packed. The energy felt different. And somewhere behind a microphone or inside a curated segment, the spotlight was probably pointed at someone else, while Clark kept forcing the issue in real time. That's when people closest to Caitlin Clark started noticing the shift. Not in her play, because that never dipped, but in how she talked about the league, her long-term future, and whether staying inside a system that clearly resented her impact even made sense. She started questioning the value of pouring everything into something that refused to fully accept her. As she put it to someone she trusted, "Why would I keep building a house for people who won't let me live in it?" That line didn't stay private for long. Within 2 days, it was circulating quietly, and suddenly the discussion moved past box scores and highlight reels. This wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about respect. Sue Bird didn't take long to respond from a distance. That's how it usually goes. Established figures feel pressure and frame it as immaturity, as growing pains, as proof that youth doesn't yet understand how the long game works. But the fans saw it differently. Social media didn't fill up with surface-level takes. It filled with something far more unsettling for the league: solidarity. People who had never followed women's basketball before Clark showed up started sharing their own stories. Being overlooked, being told they didn't fit, being shut out of spaces they earned through results, not connections. At that point, Clark stopped being just a player. She became a symbol, and symbols don't move on command. That's when the league office started feeling uneasy. Not because of controversy, they know how to survive that, but because the data told a story they couldn't massage. Viewership dipped when Clark wasn't on the floor. Attendance stalled in markets she skipped. The growth everyone pointed to wasn't evenly spread. It followed her. She wasn't lifting all boats. She was the boat. And if she ever chose to dock somewhere else, another league, another platform, somewhere that actually valued her pull, the ripple would be impossible to ignore. The WNBA's so-called historic growth was suddenly at risk of being exposed for what it really was: fragile, dependent, built on one engine. And people inside the league knew it. The same voices that had brushed Caitlin Clark aside started reaching out. Calls turned urgent. Meetings were requested. Questions shifted toward her long-term vision and whether the league could do more to support her path. The timing said everything, because Clark had already made up her mind not about leaving, at least not yet, but about something more fundamental. She was done acting like the disrespect didn't exist, done covering for people who never covered for her. And she was ready to say that out loud. The interview was locked in with a major sports network. Prime time. No pre-approved questions. No handlers steering the conversation. Just Caitlin Clark, a camera, and half an hour to speak freely. That alone made the establishment uneasy. Sue Bird's camp moved quickly. Media appearances started stacking up. The language softened. Misunderstandings, different viewpoints, everyone wanting what's best for the league. It sounded familiar, and it landed flat. The shift was obvious, and fans weren't buying it. Everyone could feel what was coming. Clark was about to step past the line they'd quietly drawn around her. Once that happened, there was no resetting the narrative. The interview aired on a Tuesday night, right in the middle of the sports cycle, when eyes were already tuned in. And within the opening moments, it was clear this wasn't going to be another polished, media-trained appearance. This was something else, the kind of moment you don't walk back from. This is where it turned into open conflict. Caitlin Clark began calmly, her voice steady but sharp enough to pull everyone in. She talked about being told to feel grateful. Grateful for the opportunity, grateful for the platform, grateful just to be allowed to play the game she loves. She paused and let the silence stretch, then pointed out what was missing from the conversation. No one ever talked about what the league itself should be grateful for. She laid it out clearly. The packed arenas, the fans who showed up because of her, the young girls who had never paid attention to women's basketball until they saw someone play the way they wanted to play. The interviewer tried to ease the tension, steering towards safer ground, asking about personal growth and lessons learned. Clark didn't take the hint. She acknowledged the reality head-on. There are people in the league, respected figures, legends whose voices carry weight, who have made it clear she isn't their idea of what a star should be. She explained that she doesn't play the way they did, doesn't move the way they expect, doesn't fit the template they're comfortable with. Then she looked straight into the camera and said that she's the one selling tickets, which might mean the template itself needs questioning. The reaction was instant. Clips spread across social media in seconds. No guessing was needed about who she was referencing, even without names. Sue Bird was the unspoken focal point. Analysts rushed to respond. The WNBA's communications team shifted into damage control mode. Sue Bird stayed quiet for 18 hours. Then she posted. The message was polished and measured on the surface, but loaded underneath. She wrote, "I've spent my entire career trying to build something sustainable for the next generation. Real growth comes from respecting the game, respecting the process, and understanding that individual success means nothing if the foundation crumbles." Some people understood immediately. Others clearly still had work to do. That closing remark hit hard because telling someone they still need to learn is language usually reserved for children or for people you don't see as equals. It implied that Caitlin Clark hadn't earned a seat she had already paid for in results, attention, and impact. Clark noticed it. The fans noticed it. And her response came fast. Within 2 hours, she answered without another interview, without a long explanation, without softening the edge. Just a short social media post that flipped the entire conversation on its head. Instead of attacking anyone directly, she exposed the contradiction underneath it all. The message landed instantly and spread everywhere. The illusion cracked. The so-called golden era that Sue Bird and others referenced so often hadn't been filling arenas or dominating headlines. For years, games played in half-full buildings with limited coverage. That didn't change until Clark arrived and forced the spotlight to stay. Suddenly, the league couldn't hide behind talk of tradition or respect anymore because the version of the game they claimed to protect had been invisible to most of the sports world before one player made it unavoidable. That's when the lines got drawn. Not quietly, but clearly. Future versus legacy. Results versus tradition. Momentum versus comfort. And the old guard felt the pressure. This stopped being about personalities and turned into a fight over control. Who decides what the WNBA becomes next? Whether it adapts to the moment or slips back into a space that feels safe internally but irrelevant externally. Diana Taurasi stepped in next. A long post followed, stressing the importance of paying dues, respecting those who came before, and remembering that the league existed long before any single player and would continue afterward. The intent was obvious. Reassert the hierarchy. Put Clark back in line. It didn't land the way it was meant to. Fans started digging. Old clips resurfaced. Early career moments where Taurasi herself was labeled too brash, too confident, too much. The irony wasn't lost. What was framed as a lesson ended up reinforcing Clark's point all over again. She didn't follow the humble superstar script, and that's what exposed the hypocrisy. The same edge, confidence, and defiance that once helped turn Diana Taurasi into a legend was now being treated like a flaw when Caitlin Clark showed it. The difference was scale. Clark was doing it with bigger numbers, larger crowds, wider reach, and undeniable impact. That made people uncomfortable, and that discomfort is what this was really about. It wasn't about respect. It wasn't about tradition or doing things the right way. It was fear. Fear that the stories they spent years shaping were losing their grip. Fear that carefully curated images were being blown up by a 23-year-old who didn't wait for approval before dominating. One player was rewriting the rules in real time, and the old framework couldn't keep up. The media tried to slow it down. Analysts were brought in. Panels were split. Debates were staged about tone, respect, and whether Clark had crossed an invisible line or whether veterans were simply guarding territory. But none of that mattered. The audience had already rendered a verdict, and it showed up where it always does, in numbers. Clark's jersey sales surged in the days following the interview. Her next game pulled the highest non-playoff viewership the WNBA had ever recorded. Cities on her schedule started selling out weeks ahead of time. The momentum wasn't theoretical, it was measurable. Meanwhile, the Protect the Culture crowd kept talking to a shrinking circle. Culture alone doesn't sustain leagues. Relevance does. And only one player was delivering it consistently. The tension finally cracked when leaked audio surfaced from a private conversation involving several longtime WNBA veterans, pushing the situation past speculation and into something far more volatile. The leak removed all doubt. Someone had recorded a private group conversation where several veterans weren't talking about Caitlin Clark's game, her stats, or her influence. They were talking about what they called the Clark problem. Not her performance, but the way her success made others look by comparison. The frustration wasn't subtle. There was resentment over packed arenas, over the implication that years of accomplishments hadn't translated into widespread attention. The tone made one thing clear. This was never just about basketball. The audio barely lasted 40 seconds, but it landed hard. It confirmed everything Clark had been hinting at without ever saying outright. This was about control, about status, about fear of being eclipsed by someone who didn't rise through the same channels or follow the same unwritten rules. The people who once held all the influence were panicking because that influence was slipping. Clark's response was deliberate and disarming. She didn't fire back. She didn't issue a statement. She didn't defend herself or escalate the situation. Instead, she shared a simple image of herself signing autographs for a long line of young fans wrapping around the arena. The message was clear without spelling it out. This was bigger than egos or politics. That restraint mattered. It undercut the narrative her critics wanted. They needed her to snap, needed her to lash out, needed proof that she was too emotional or too reckless to carry the league's spotlight. Instead, she came off focused, grounded, and locked in on the people who actually showed up. While others looked territorial and exposed, Sue Bird remained silent. No comment on the recording, no distancing, no condemnation of the tone that had been revealed. That silence carried weight of its own. And Caitlin Clark stopped pretending she didn't understand exactly what it meant. The very next game, Caitlin Clark delivered a performance that forced history to take notice. 42 points, 9 deep threes, control from the opening tip through the final horn. There was no debate about who owned the moment. Afterward, a reporter asked if she had anything to say to her critics. Clark smiled, not the polished, rehearsed smile people expect, but the real one that signals confidence. She made it clear she had already said everything that mattered through her play. She walked off, leaving the league's power structure scrambling. Because this wasn't a star they could shape or steer. The league office moved quickly and quietly. An emergency meeting was called, not the kind announced in press releases, but the kind that involves lawyers, closed doors, and non-disclosure agreements. Caitlin Clark wasn't invited, even though the entire meeting centered on her. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert sat at the head of the table, surrounded by executives whose shared mission boiled down to protecting the brand, and the brand was cracking under pressure. On one side sat the numbers, unprecedented growth tied directly to one player, revenue projections that would have sounded unrealistic just a few seasons earlier, sponsors finally treating women's basketball as a serious investment. On the other side sat the foundation, veteran players, established legends, the voices that built credibility over decades and still held sway over public perception. The fear wasn't subtle. If those figures felt pushed aside, they could turn influence into opposition overnight. Sue Bird wasn't physically in the room, but her presence was unmistakable. Her perspective echoed through every concern about culture, sustainability, and not alienating long-standing supporters. One executive stated the obvious: losing Clark wasn't an option. Neither was open conflict with the legends. The room went quiet. Everyone understood the dilemma. Choosing between the past and the future meant risking one of them walking away. The solution they reached was predictable and deeply flawed. Try to appease everyone. Issue carefully balanced statements. Emphasize respect for all eras. Corporate language designed to soothe tensions without resolving anything at all. That approach satisfied no one. You can't broker peace through press releases, and this had moved far past a disagreement. While the league tried to play mediator, the conflict kept intensifying on every front. Social media turned into a non-stop battleground. Every post, every quote, every highlight was dissected for hidden meaning and motive. When Paige Bueckers returned from injury and scored 25 points in her comeback, the coverage was overwhelming. Feature stories rolled out back-to-back. Analysts flooded the airwaves. Comparisons to all-time greats came fast. The presentation felt cinematic. High-end graphics, slow-motion edits, dramatic music cues. It was engineered to create a defining moment. For fans already invested in that storyline, it landed.
I'm trying to do some things. I'm going to have to get some looks at some different people and some different lineups. Yeah. So it's definitely how I'm viewing it.
She's definitely building Team USA around Paige Bueckers.
But casual viewers picked up on something else. The urgency, the forced tone, the sense that every achievement was being amplified to compete with what Caitlin Clark was generating naturally without assistance. Bueckers never asked for that weight. She was focused on getting back on the floor and playing her game. But she became a symbol anyway. The approved future, the safer face, the player who checked every box the establishment valued. That meant every success became a comparison point. Every struggle became a talking point used to validate old opinions. It wasn't fair to Bueckers, but fairness stopped mattering once this shifted from performance to control. Meanwhile, Clark was dealing with a different kind of pressure, the physical kind. When influence can't be managed through coverage or narrative, other methods appear. The next stretch of games turned rough, hard fouls piled up, contact that flirted with flagrant territory went largely unpunished. Whistles stayed silent when Clark drove to the basket, and the commentary followed suit. The same analysts who once filled airtime with concern about safety went quiet. The inconsistency didn't go unnoticed. When Caitlin Clark took an elbow to the ribs or got knocked out of the air on a layup, she kept going. She limped through one game, needed stitches in another, took contact that would have sidelined most players and still dropped over 30 in all 3 games. That's how real greatness responds. Pressure doesn't shrink it, it amplifies it. And yet the silence from the league's loudest voices stayed heavy. Sue Bird didn't post about player safety. She didn't raise concern. She didn't use her platform the way she had in similar moments for other players. The absence spoke clearly. Clark was on her own. Teammates noticed. They got more physical protecting her. They got more vocal, even while stars elsewhere stayed careful with their words. One teammate said in an interview that things felt different when Clark was on the floor. The whistle changed. Defenders played with more freedom, and it felt like nobody with a microphone wanted to acknowledge it. That comment made the rounds fast. It forced people who had been sitting comfortably in the middle to finally choose a side. At this point, ignoring what was happening took effort. Aja Wilson broke her silence in a way only she could, direct, thoughtful, and measured. During a press conference, she said she respects every era of the game, but also understands that growth is uncomfortable, and sometimes the people who built something have to make room for those who are going to push it further. She added that building forward doesn't erase history, it adds to it. It was a careful balance, honoring the legends while defending progress, respecting the past without letting it choke the future. The message landed, and the old guard noticed. Diana Taurasi followed with a subtweet about real ones knowing the difference between flash and substance. Sue Bird liked the post, then unliked it, then reposted it with a brief comment of agreement. Screenshots spread instantly. Threads popped up breaking down every click and reversal. The sequence mattered, the hesitation mattered, and everyone watching understood that the quiet tension had officially gone public. It was messy, public, and exactly what the league didn't need, but it was also unavoidable. Tension like this doesn't stay contained forever. Eventually it spills out, and this was only the beginning. Corporate sponsors started paying close attention, not with public statements, but behind closed doors in private meetings with league leadership. The message was consistent across the board. They were investing in growth, and if the faces of the league were openly clashing instead of building together, that became a serious problem. The translation was simple: fix it or risk losing funding. At that point, the stakes moved beyond pride and legacy. This became financial and existential. The WNBA had spent decades chasing investment, attention, and stability. Now that momentum finally existed, the people credited with building the league were locked in conflict with the player actually driving the growth. From a business standpoint, it was self-destructive. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert made one last attempt to cool things down. A private call was arranged. Caitlin Clark, Sue Bird, a few other influential voices. It was framed as a forward-looking discussion about the future of women's basketball. Clark agreed to participate. She joined on time. She came prepared with ideas that balanced honoring the league's history while expanding its reach. Bird joined late. She talked over Clark. Several of Clark's suggestions were brushed aside as short-term thinking rather than long-term vision. The tone shifted quickly. 15 minutes into the call, Clark disconnected. No speech, no announcement. She simply left and moved on. What followed was quiet and uncomfortable. According to people familiar with the meeting, no one spoke for several seconds. Someone suggested trying to bring Clark back into the conversation. Bird pushed back. Her response implied that Clark's decision to leave reflected more on her professionalism than on the conversation itself. That moment lingered, because for anyone paying attention, it raised a different question entirely. Not whether Clark could handle the league, but whether the league was ready to handle what she represented. That line leaked within hours, And Caitlin Clark's response said everything without saying much at all. She posted a short video of herself training. Just her. Just a basketball. No music, no caption, no explanation, pure work. The message underneath it was impossible to miss. While others talked, she was putting in reps. Fans understood immediately. The post spread fast. Millions of views, thousands of comments from people who recognized the moment because they had lived it themselves. People who had been talked over in meetings, dismissed in rooms they earned their way into, told their success was timing or luck instead of skill and sacrifice. By then, Clark wasn't just a basketball player anymore. She represented anyone who had been told to be quiet, be grateful, and accept less. The real shift came from an unexpected direction. Not from legends, not from veterans guarding their influence. It came from the players still in the fight, the ones sharing the court with Clark every night, the ones who saw what was happening up close and decided they couldn't ignore it anymore. It started with Sabrina Ionescu. After another game where Clark absorbed heavy contact with no whistle, she posted a short message calling for talent to be protected across the board. No caveats, no exceptions. Minutes later, Brianna Stewart backed it. Then Kelsey Plum followed, then Jewel Lloyd, then Arika Ogunbowale. One by one, current stars made their stance clear. There were no long essays, no dramatic speeches, just quiet alignment that said enough. They saw the pattern, they didn't like it, and they weren't going to pretend it was normal. That's when everything changed. These weren't rookies or outsiders who could be brushed off as inexperienced. These were MVPs champions, Olympians, players with real credibility, and they were all pointing to the same reality. What was happening to Caitlin Clark had nothing to do with basketball standards or respect for tradition. It was something else entirely, and the league could no longer pretend it wasn't being watched. At its core, this was about fear. Sue Bird couldn't brush this aside the way she had with Caitlin Clark. She couldn't frame it as immaturity or inexperience. These weren't rookies speaking up. These were her peers, her contemporaries, players with equal credibility who refused to support the narrative she had been leaning on. For the first time since this conflict began, Bird found herself standing alone. She tried to shift the framing. A post about healthy debate and the value of different perspectives went up. It didn't land. The momentum had already moved. The younger generation had made its choice, and it was looking forward, not backward. Media outlets could no longer treat this as a single-player controversy. What started with Clark had turned into a league-wide question about leadership, evolution, and whether women's basketball was prepared to fully embrace its breakthrough or quietly undermine it out of insecurity. ESPN stepped in with a deep dive that avoided the usual hedging. No puff piece, no forced balance. They broke down the numbers: viewership, attendance, social engagement, merchandise sales, every category separated by player, market, and audience segment. The results undercut the argument that this was about collective growth. The impact was concentrated. Games featuring Caitlin Clark averaged over 1 million viewers. Games without her hovered around a fraction of that. Arenas she visited sold out in hours. The same buildings for other matchups struggled to reach 2/3 capacity. The league's recent surge wasn't broad momentum, it was gravitational. Clark wasn't just part of the system, she was the force pulling everything into motion. The report also included feedback from casual fans, people who had never followed women's basketball before she arrived. Their responses followed a pattern. They tuned in because of her. If she wasn't playing, interest dropped. They liked the confidence, the energy, the clarity. Many admitted they couldn't name most of the other players. That takeaway spread quickly because it couldn't be reframed or softened. The league had spent decades trying to build recognizable stars. One player did it in 2 seasons by being visible, unapologetic, and effective. The uncomfortable part wasn't her rise. It was how resistant some were to celebrating it. Resentment finally surfaced more clearly when Sue Bird sat down for a longer interview. She tried to clarify her stance, soften her tone, and explain that she never intended to diminish anyone's accomplishments. She spoke about wanting what was best for everyone involved, but midway through, she couldn't help herself. She added that sustainable growth comes from a foundation, not from something fleeting. There it was again, the subtle jab. The suggestion that Caitlin Clark's impact was temporary, shallow or inflated. A distinction Bird seemed determined to make between what she considered real influence and what she didn't. To the interviewer's credit, the follow-up came directly. Was she saying Clark was just a flash? Bird hesitated. She tried to backtrack, mentioning context and intention, but the moment had already passed. In trying to sound measured while holding her ground, she exposed the belief many already suspected. She didn't see Clark's success as legitimate in the same way her own had been. Clark didn't respond publicly. She didn't need to. Instead, people around her began sharing what they'd witnessed, not through anonymous leaks or attacks, but through straightforward conversations. One coach described a moment after a particularly rough game. Clark came off the floor bleeding from a cut above her eye. She didn't complain. She didn't point fingers. She got stitched up and then spent 2 hours signing autographs because kids had been waiting. That was the pattern. Effort first, fans first. Those stories started circulating more widely. They painted a picture that went beyond scoring and numbers. This wasn't just a gifted player. This was someone deeply invested in growing the game, even while parts of the establishment seemed determined to contain her. And while the debates dragged on, corporate sponsors were already acting. Nike didn't issue a press release. They didn't need to. Their WNBA marketing strategy shifted decisively. Campaigns, visuals, and promotion began centering almost entirely around Caitlin Clark. Not subtly and not by accident. Marketing plans started changing in real time. Campaigns were redesigned mid-rollout to feature Caitlin Clark more prominently. Other brands followed the same path. Gatorade adjusted, State Farm adjusted. Every major company with money invested in the WNBA began shifting resources toward the player who was actually driving sales and changing public perception. The league had no way to stop it. Sponsors weren't acting on emotion or loyalty. They were acting on data. And the data didn't care about legacy, internal politics, or who believed they deserved to be the face of the sport. Attention drives revenue. Revenue follows relevance. And relevance was following Clark. That created a new problem for the old power structure: irrelevance. Because once the media focuses on Clark, once sponsors invest in Clark, once fans show up for Clark, the value of approval from former gatekeepers starts to fade. Respect stops being currency when the audience has already made its choice. The balance of power was flipping in plain sight. The people who had shaped the narrative for decades were watching their influence shrink as the audience they claimed to represent moved on. Paige Bueckers, caught in the middle of a fight she never asked for, finally addressed it publicly. Her message was simple and unfiltered. She wanted to play basketball. She didn't ask to be framed as a rival or an alternative. She acknowledged that Clark was doing incredible things for the game, while she was focused on doing her part too. She made it clear there was room for both, as long as people with platforms stopped trying to turn it into a rivalry. It was measured and self-aware, and it cut directly at the media and former players who had been using her name to undermine Clark. Sue Bird attempted to position Bueckers' words as support for her own stance, framing it as validation of respecting all voices. That didn't hold. Bueckers responded quickly and clearly, reinforcing that Clark's voice mattered, especially Clark's. In that moment, the shield fell away. Bird could no longer claim she was protecting players broadly when the players themselves were asking not to be used as tools to diminish someone else. The league office was in full panic mode. The brand they had spent years carefully managing was starting to fracture in public. Legends were coming off as defensive. Current stars were openly divided. Fans were no longer neutral. They were choosing sides. And through all of it, the numbers kept sending the same message over and over. Caitlin Clark had become the most valuable asset the WNBA had ever seen, and internal power struggles were putting that at risk. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert made one last attempt to regain control. A unity summit was announced, bringing together players, coaches, and media to talk about the future of women's basketball. The language was polished and collaborative, but the intent was obvious: get everyone in the same room and force a resolution. Clark's camp responded cautiously. She would consider attending if her schedule allowed. The meaning wasn't hard to read. This wasn't going to be a mandatory appearance where she sat quietly and absorbed lectures from people who questioned her value. The summit was scheduled. Invitations went out. Media speculation followed immediately, centered on whether Clark would even show up. Then, 2 days before the event, everything shifted. A journalist from The Athletic published a detailed investigation that had nothing to do with feuds or personality clashes. It was about money, specifically how revenue from the league's recent growth was being distributed and who was actually benefiting from it. The article dropped early in the morning and spread fast. The headline was blunt and precise, focusing on the disconnect between growth and compensation. Within the opening sections, the reporting laid out a stark imbalance. Caitlin Clark, the player tied directly to a massive spike in attendance and viewership, was still earning on a standard rookie scale. At the same time, veteran figures with limited on-court roles were collecting endorsement deals, consulting fees, and speaking income tied to league growth initiatives. The reporting included documentation, contract structures, sponsorship allocations, marketing budgets that funneled significant resources toward legacy players positioned as brand ambassadors, while Clark continued doing the heavy lifting through performance and visibility. One section stood out. It detailed how Sue Bird's media company had secured a multi-million-dollar consulting agreement with the league to advise on growth strategy and player development. The implication was unavoidable. The person driving the growth wasn't sharing equally in its rewards, while those shaping the narrative were financially insulated. By the time people reached the end of the article, the conversation had changed completely. This was no longer just about respect or recognition. It was about power, money, and who truly benefited from the league's so-called progress. Just months after Caitlin Clark's rookie season rewrote every commercial benchmark, it became clear how deep the contradiction really ran. Sue Bird was being paid to advise on league growth at the same time she was publicly casting doubt on the very player driving that growth. The conflict of interest was impossible to ignore, and the reporting didn't stop there. The investigation followed the money. Through WNBA, affiliated entities, foundations, media partnerships, and player development programs, a pattern emerged. Resources were being funneled toward a small circle of former players who shared one defining trait. They were all members of the old guard, and they were all actively resisting Clark's rise. This wasn't about personal dislike or bruised egos anymore. It was financial. Their influence translated directly into income. Their advisory roles, speaking fees, and brand partnerships depended on preserving a power structure where legacy mattered more than measurable impact. Clark threatened that system by exposing how outdated it had become. If sponsors began paying for results instead of reputation, if resources started flowing toward whoever actually moved the needle, those post-career revenue streams would dry up fast. That's what made this so explosive. The language around respecting the game collapsed under the weight of the evidence. This was about protecting income, not protecting basketball. The internet reacted instantly. Traffic spiked so fast, platforms struggled to keep up. Screenshots spread, users pulled additional records, new connections surfaced. What looked like isolated decisions began to resemble an entire ecosystem of quiet self-dealing that had operated unnoticed for years. Sue Bird went silent. Scheduled podcast episodes disappeared. Public appearances were canceled. Her social media feeds stopped updating. For the first time in a long time, there was no statement to soften the narrative. No framing that could make this look like anything other than self-interest. The WNBA issued a response within hours. Standard language about reviewing partnerships and ensuring transparency. It landed flat. Fans didn't feel misled by Clark. She had been consistent from the start. They felt betrayed by the league and by the figures they had been told to trust. People who spoke about what was best for women's basketball while quietly benefiting from keeping its biggest star contained. After 3 days of silence, Clark finally posted. Not about the investigation. Not about money. Not about the league. Just an image of her alone in an empty gym getting shots up. No explanation needed. The message was understood without words. While others were maneuvering behind the scenes, she had been doing the same thing she always did, putting in the work. While others were focused on holding her back, Caitlin Clark kept moving forward. Her post exploded across platforms, pulling in roughly 20 million impressions in just 6 hours. The engagement alone outpaced viewership numbers for most WNBA playoff games. The contrast was impossible to ignore. and it immediately changed the tone around the Unity Summit scheduled 2 days later. What had been framed as a feel-good moment for unity and healing no longer felt light or cooperative. The summit now carried the weight of accountability. Players began quietly backing out. Not the younger generation, they were more locked in than ever, but veterans. The same names connected to the financial reporting. The same figures suddenly being advised by attorneys to limit public comments, while business arrangements were under review. Then, the day before the summit, Diana Taurasi announced her retirement effective immediately. The timing raised eyebrows. The statement was short and reflective, focused on closing a chapter and making space for the next generation. There was no farewell tour, no final season, just an abrupt exit at the exact moment scrutiny intensified. Staying would have meant answering questions about money, about influence, about why she had been so outspoken against Clark while benefiting from systems tied directly to the growth Clark had created. Those weren't questions with clean answers. Media coverage tried to follow a familiar script: career retrospectives, highlights, praise for her on-court greatness, the usual treatment reserved for legends. But the reaction online told a different story. Fans weren't following the script anymore. They had context now, and they weren't letting it go. The sentiment repeated itself across platforms. Respect for what she accomplished between the lines. Disappointment in how she handled the moment off the court. Many pointed out the contrast between her legacy and her role in undermining the league's most transformative new star. Sue Bird found herself in an even tighter spot. Retirement wasn't an option. Her playing career had ended years earlier. Her influence now came from media, commentary, and her role as a trusted voice meant to connect generations. And that position depended entirely on credibility. As the summit approached, it was clear the ground had shifted. This was no longer about managing a controversy. It was about whether the people in power could survive a moment where control had already slipped out of their hands. That bridge was burning fast. Sponsors began creating distance without making noise about it. Partnerships were quietly paused. Her podcast was postponed indefinitely by the network, explained away with vague scheduling language. Speaking engagements disappeared from calendars one by one. After months of trying to shrink Caitlin Clark's influence, Sue Bird was watching her own platform erode in real time. The night before the Unity Summit, Clark didn't sit down with a major network or a polished sports show. Instead, she chose a small independent podcast hosted by a former player who had been advocating for women's basketball long before it became profitable. The setting was stripped down. The conversation was direct. Clark made it clear she never asked to be at the center of a power struggle. She talked about wanting to play basketball, connect with fans, and grow the game naturally. Then she explained what changed. Seeing how the system actually operated. Understanding that the same people preaching humility were benefiting financially from her staying small. That realization shifted everything. She said she wasn't going to shrink herself for tradition, approval, or money, especially when respect was never truly on the table to begin with. She explained that being exactly who she is matters more than comfort, and that discomfort often signals progress. When the interviewer asked about the summit, Clark didn't dodge it. She confirmed she would attend. Not to smooth things over, but to be present. To look people in the eye as they explained how their actions were supposedly for the good of the league, while financial records told a different story. Clips from the interview spread fast. Views climbed into the millions before the night ended. The takeaway was unmistakable. Clark wasn't intimidated. She wasn't retreating. And she wasn't interested in playing along with a system that had been working against her. By morning, the atmosphere at league headquarters reflected that reality. Security was tightened. Non-disclosure agreements were circulated. Phones were collected at the door. What had been advertised as a summit about unity now felt more like a reckoning that couldn't be delayed any longer. They treated it like a deposition, not a conversation, because that's what it had become. The first session was meant to focus on a shared vision for the future. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert opened with prepared remarks about unity, growth, and respecting every contribution to the sport. It lasted less than 10 minutes before Caitlin Clark raised her hand. She asked if they could talk about the money. The room went still. Engelbert tried to redirect, saying there would be space for financial topics later, that the priority right now was healing and moving forward. Clark didn't let it slide. She explained that moving forward without addressing why everyone was there made no sense. The investigation had already laid the groundwork. She pointed out that people in the room had profited from the league's growth while publicly undermining the player driving it. That consulting fees were paid for strategy advice, while the real strategy was keeping her on the margins. Before unity could mean anything, honesty had to come first. Sue Bird shifted in her seat and avoided eye contact. Another veteran tried to step in with a familiar angle about youth and not fully understanding how business works. Aja Wilson cut it off immediately. She said Clark understood exactly what was happening, and that was the issue. Everyone understood it now. In that moment, the mask dropped. This stopped being Clark versus the league. It became truth versus the version of reality people had grown comfortable protecting. The summit unraveled fast. Accusations surfaced. Defenses followed. Some walked out. Others finally spoke about things they had seen, been told to ignore, or quietly accepted to stay in good standing. Conversations spilled over each other. By midday, order was gone. By evening, the summit was effectively finished. What ended wasn't just the event. It was the old structure that had held power without accountability. Exposed, it couldn't survive. Caitlin Clark left the building without stopping for cameras or questions. She didn't issue a statement. She didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been said where it counted. The consequences landed fast. By the next morning, 3 major board members had resigned. There were no graceful exits or polished explanations about new opportunities. The departures were abrupt, signaling what everyone already understood. The league had crossed a point of no return, and whatever came next would be built on very different terms. They weren't stepping down by choice. Everyone understood that. Once financial conflicts were exposed on record, in real time, there was no path back. Especially after audio from what was supposed to be a closed-door session surfaced within 12 hours. It wasn't authorized. It wasn't approved. But it was real, and it was devastating. The recordings captured conversations that stripped away every remaining illusion. Sue Bird's voice was heard mid-argument, emphasizing that she and others had built the league when no one was paying attention, and therefore deserved to benefit from its success, no matter who was driving the current growth. Another clip featured a senior league executive acknowledging that Caitlin Clark's numbers were undeniable, while insisting that no single player could be allowed too much leverage because it would complicate future negotiations. The most damaging segment came from a private exchange between 2 veteran players during a break. They talked openly about letting Clark fill arenas, while others collected growth bonuses tied to league performance. The plan was to restructure the system before Clark ever reached a contract level that matched her impact. It was cold, it was strategic, and it was impossible to defend. The audio spread instantly. Social platforms lit up. Sports networks ran the clips on repeat. Analysts who had spent months promoting narratives about respect and tradition shifted overnight, suddenly claiming skepticism they had never shown before. The reversal was blatant, but predictable. When the truth becomes too clear to manage, everyone rewrites their position. Caitlin Clark said nothing for a day and a half. She didn't react. She didn't comment. She let the recordings do the work. Let the league unravel on its own terms. When she finally posted, it wasn't about power struggles or fallout. It was an announcement. She shared that she was launching the Clark Foundation, focused on providing resources, facilities, and opportunities for young athletes who don't fit the traditional mold. No mention of the leaks, no commentary on the people exposed, just a forward-looking move that reframed the entire moment. While others were caught on tape discussing how to protect their advantage, Clark was redirecting attention to building something new, and that contrast landed harder than any response ever could. Sometimes the only option is to build your own table. The message underneath Clark's move landed immediately. If the existing system refuses to make room, you don't wait. You create something new. And Caitlin Clark had the leverage to do it. The endorsement deals that parts of the old guard tried to downplay gave her real independence. Not symbolic influence, but actual power. The kind that doesn't depend on approval, hierarchy, or tradition. The response came fast. Within hours, other players began stepping forward. Not veterans clinging to status, but younger stars who had been watching closely and learning. Sabrina Ionescu signed on as an ambassador. Paige Bueckers shocked almost everyone by joining the advisory board. Even Aja Wilson, who had been careful to stay balanced, made a public donation and expressed support. The alignment mattered. This wasn't symbolic unity. It was a coalition forming in real time, centered around players who understood where the game was heading. The structure the old guard tried to contain was now reorganizing itself without them. League leadership attempted to regain footing. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert went on a media run, speaking about new initiatives and player-focused reforms. An independent review of business relationships and consulting agreements was announced. The timing undercut the message. Announcing reform after exposure isn't leadership, it's damage control. Sponsors didn't wait. Nike went beyond reshuffling campaigns. They launched an entirely new internal division focused on athletes who disrupt systems rather than maintain them. Clark was a central figure, but the signal extended further. Investment would follow impact, not gatekeeping. Other brands followed the same logic. Within weeks, a parallel economy emerged. One track revolved around Clark, and the players aligned with her vision. The other clung to the traditional structure, struggling to stay relevant as attention shifted away. The market didn't hesitate. The choice was obvious. 3 weeks after the summit, Sue Bird finally spoke. Not through an interview or a broadcast, but in a carefully written essay published in the Players' Tribune. The timing alone spoke volumes. The essay struck a complicated tone, reflective in moments, apologetic in parts, defensive in others. Sue Bird wrote about spending her career fighting for women's basketball, framing every decision as an attempt to protect something she cared deeply about. She acknowledged in a limited way that protection can sometimes turn into resistance, and that even well-meaning resistance can slow progress. It was the closest she came to admitting fault. Still, she couldn't fully release the idea that her intentions justified her actions. The response split along predictable lines. Some readers appreciated the effort and saw it as a step toward accountability. Others viewed it as too late, a calculated attempt to preserve credibility after the damage had already been done. Caitlin Clark didn't respond publicly. According to people around her, she read it, acknowledged it, and moved forward. For Clark, this was never about tearing down Sue Bird. It was about refusing to let herself be diminished. There's a difference. When the 2025 season tipped off, the atmosphere felt different across the league. Arenas were full, not only for Clark's games, though those remained the hardest tickets to find, but across the schedule. The conflict had drawn attention, and once attention locks in, it doesn't always leave. That shift reached the business side fast. The WNBA's television deal was renegotiated before the original contract even expired. Networks that once showed little interest were now competing aggressively for rights. The new agreement came in at nearly 4 times the previous value. Buried in the details was a significant change. Revenue sharing was now tied to measurable individual player impact on viewership and attendance. Not reputation, not legacy, results. Caitlin Clark was finally positioned to be compensated in line with what she brought to the league. More importantly, the structure had changed. Future stars wouldn't have to fight the same battle. The system had been forced to adapt, not because leadership chose progress, but because one player refused to accept limits placed on her potential. That's what legacy actually looks like. Not guarding what you built, but clearing the path so the next generation doesn't have to fight the same fights. Caitlin Clark's first game of the season came against a team in which Sue Bird held partial ownership, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Media outlets tried to turn it into a spectacle. Clark shut that down immediately. "I'm not playing against Sue Bird. I'm playing basketball."
Simply wasn't true.
It's something you kind of just become used to. It's like people think they know what's going on inside of your locker room, and they just don't. At the end of the day, it's just, the girls that you have in there, and then obviously your coaching staff, and that's all that matters.
That's all I've ever been trying to do. Simple, clean, unavoidable. What followed on the court backed it up. Clark put on a performance that felt deliberate and effortless at the same time. 41 points, 9 three-pointers. She controlled the tempo, carved up the defense, and ran the offense like it was second nature. The energy inside the arena wasn't limited to one fan base. There was a shared sense that something bigger was happening. This wasn't just another regular season game, it felt like a marker, a moment people would point back to and say, that's when it fully shifted. After the final buzzer, Clark walked toward the tunnel. As she passed the ownership section, Sue Bird was there watching. Their eyes met briefly, No exchange, no reaction, just acknowledgement. Then Clark kept moving. She had autographs to sign, fans to meet, a foundation to grow. The past had already taken enough of her time. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected but overdue happened. The narrative changed on its own. Media coverage drifted away from conflict and toward impact. Stories surfaced about young girls picking up a basketball because of Clark, communities building programs around her foundation, real outcomes, measurable change. Those stories didn't rely on outrage or drama. They didn't need to. They were simply true. And truth has a way of asserting itself, even when it takes longer than it should. Sue Bird made one final public statement before stepping back from media almost entirely. It was brief and posted without fanfare. "I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was right about one. The game is bigger than any of us, including me, especially me. Caitlin Clark is showing us what the future looks like, and it's brighter than I gave her credit for." By then, the point had already been made, not through words, but through action. And that's the kind of legacy that lasts. For some people, it still wasn't enough. They kept recalculating the past, debating credit, replaying old arguments. Caitlin Clark never responded. She didn't need to. While others were stuck dissecting what had already happened, she was busy building what came next. 6 months after the summit, the WNBA looked nothing like it did before. New leadership, new systems, a different energy altogether. The old guard didn't vanish overnight. Some stayed on in reduced roles. Others moved into separate ventures. But what changed was control. They no longer dictated the direction or the narrative. Players held real power now, not symbolic power, actual leverage rooted in understanding their value and refusing to accept less. And that shift traced back to one player who looked at a system designed to keep her contained and declined without bitterness or rage. Just quiet certainty, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're worth and not pretending otherwise for anyone's comfort. That's the real story. Not the feuds, not the arguments, not even the numbers, as wild as they were. It's what happens when talent meets timing and courage, when someone recognizes the limits being placed on them and chooses to step past those boundaries instead of shrinking to fit inside them. Caitlin Clark didn't just change basketball, she changed what felt possible. Every young player coming up behind her felt it. Every girl watching from the stands or her living room felt it. Every person who had ever been told to dim themselves so others could shine saw a different option. Not a path without resistance, but one that moves through it with intention and comes out stronger. A year later, the transformation was undeniable, not just in policy or structure, but in culture. The WNBA had become something it never fully achieved before, impossible to ignore. Clark's third season opener aired in prime time on ESPN and drew 3.2 million viewers, a number that outperformed multiple NBA playoff games from the year before. Networks rushed to expand coverage. Analysts who had spent entire careers focused on men's sports were suddenly breaking down Clark's reads, spacing, and defensive decisions. The game had arrived, and everyone knew who carried it there. The most meaningful shift, though, happened quietly, in locker rooms, in draft prep conversations, among the next wave of players entering the league. They weren't asking how to fit into the system anymore. They were asking how to build their own. Clark gave them something more valuable than any scheme or playbook, a blueprint. You don't need permission to be great. You don't need approval to succeed. You need to be undeniable. And once that happens, the system has no choice but to adjust. The Clark Foundation grew faster than anyone expected. 15 facilities opened across the country. Hundreds of young athletes gained access to training, equipment, and programs. Partnerships with high schools and colleges brought resources into communities long overlooked by traditional basketball pipelines. But the most influential initiative wasn't about gyms or courts. It was about control, media education for young players, teaching them how to manage their own narratives before someone else does. Clark understood something the old guard never fully grasped. Performance is only part of the equation. How a story is told, who tells it, and when it's released can determine a career just as much as points or wins. That's where players are often vulnerable. And that's where Clark focused her energy. She wasn't just teaching the next generation how to play. She was showing them how to protect themselves from the same structures that once tried to minimize her. It was strategic. And for anyone who built influence by shaping young players' stories for them, it was unsettling. Paige Bueckers' relationship with Clark continued to evolve. The media kept pushing a rivalry narrative, but the reality was more interesting. It was mentorship. Bueckers paid attention to what Clark had navigated, knowing when to say yes, knowing when to walk away, building leverage before needing it, recognizing that people who tell you to wait your turn are often protecting their own. In an interview, Bueckers was asked about the pressure of constant comparison to Clark. Her response cut through the noise. She explained that there was no competition for the same space. What they were doing expanded the space. The rivalry angle made for easy headlines, but it missed the real story. Multiple stars could exist without one diminishing the other. That clarity made the old framing obsolete. Meanwhile, Sue Bird's presence in basketball media had faded. Not completely gone, but reduced. Occasional appearances, select interviews. The dominant platform she once held was no longer hers. The shift wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. It simply happened, the way real change usually does. Some of the pullback was intentional. After the backlash, Sue Bird chose to step away in certain moments. But much of it came down to market reality. Networks were no longer interested in voices anchored in nostalgia. They wanted perspectives that reflected where the game was going, not where it had been. There were quiet reports that Bird explored launching her own basketball media company. She reached out to potential investors with ideas centered on fundamentals, player development, and traditional basketball values. The interest never fully materialized. Investors weren't looking backward. They wanted momentum, scale, and relevance. And Bird was no longer central to that conversation. There was something undeniably sad about it. A legitimate legend. Someone who gave everything to women's basketball, now sidelined not because of what she did on the court, but because of how she handled what came after. Her playing legacy should have been untouchable. Instead, it was complicated by attempts to shape and limit those who followed. The takeaway was hard to miss. Legacy isn't just about what you achieve, it's about what you allow others to build. Diana Taurasi's retirement had been chaotic, but it was final. She stepped away and built a life outside basketball. By most accounts, she found peace in that distance. In quieter moments, people close to her admitted she carried regret, not about her career, but about the stance she took late. The resistance that, in hindsight, looked small rather than protective. One former teammate summed it up anonymously. She thought she was protecting the game, but she was really protecting her position within it. Those two things aren't the same. By the time that realization settled in, the landscape had already shifted. Change reached the top as well. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert stepped down to pursue other opportunities. 6 months after the summit, the league appointed a new commissioner from outside traditional basketball circles, a tech executive with deep experience in media rights and digital growth. It was a signal, not subtle, about where the WNBA believed its future truly lived. Her first major decision as commissioner sparked immediate backlash. A new revenue-sharing model was introduced, one that directly tied compensation to measurable individual player impact on league growth. The old guard pushed back hard. They argued it undermined team basketball and encouraged selfishness. But the data told a different story. Sponsorship revenue jumped more than 300% compared to 3 years earlier. Attendance reached historic highs. The league went from chasing coverage to turning down interview requests because demand outpaced capacity. And most of that growth could be traced to players who embraced their individual brands while still elevating their teams. Caitlin Clark was the clearest example, but no longer the only one. She had opened a door, and an entire generation walked through it. One of the most unexpected shifts came inside locker rooms. The old hazing culture, the quiet expectation that rookies stay silent and earn respect through limitation, faded quickly. Teams realized something simple once ego was removed from the equation. Suppressing star potential didn't help. It just guaranteed another franchise would benefit later. Veterans began mentoring instead of gatekeeping, amplifying instead of competing. They recognized that growth didn't have to be a zero-sum game. A rising tide could lift everyone, as long as no one was drilling holes in the boat. Clark had already proven it. Her success didn't reduce opportunities for others. It expanded them. More attention meant more players featured. More sponsorship money meant stronger contracts league-wide. More fans meant better travel, facilities, and infrastructure. Holding her back would have held all of that back too. For years, the old guard focused on staying on top of a small peak, never realizing they could help build an entire range. 3 years after her rookie season, Caitlin Clark signed the largest contract in WNBA history. The details leaked early. $28 million over 4 years, with incentives that could push it beyond $35 million. The previous record had been 11. Reaction was split. Some called it long overdue. Others questioned whether any player was worth that figure in a league still finding its footing. But the most common response was acceptance. By then, Clark's value wasn't theoretical. It was measurable. When the deal became official, Clark didn't post a photo of herself or the contract. She shared an image of kids at one of her foundation facilities, all wearing jerseys with their own names on the back. This is what it's for. No celebration, no victory lap, just clarity. It was a quiet reminder of why Caitlin Clark had fought so hard not to be diminished, because it was never really about her alone. It was about what her success unlocked for everyone who came next. Sue Bird liked the post. She didn't comment. She didn't add context. Just a single like. It was the first visible interaction between them in more than 2 years. People read into it in different ways. Some saw it as an olive branch, others as acceptance, some as regret. Maybe it was all of that. Or maybe it was simply acknowledgement that the conflict had run its course and the outcome was clear. Not because anyone was torn down, but because one player became so undeniably effective that the system had no option but to evolve. That's the legacy Caitlin Clark built. Not despite the resistance she faced, but because of it. Pressure didn't break her. It refined her, sharpened her, forced her to grow into something the game hadn't seen before and wouldn't forget. Not just a great player, but one who changed basketball by refusing to be reduced for anyone's comfort.
Honestly, the best thing about last year is we honestly had so much fun together. Yeah, we lost our first 8 games or whatever, but we wouldn't have won if we didn't have a tight-knit circle or a good locker room. And that's the reason we kind of turned everything around, is just we needed some time. We were a young group and, we figured it out. But yeah, it was really fun.
Her story resonated far beyond the court, especially with anyone who had ever been told to wait, to stay small, to respect limits that weren't built for them. Clark didn't just push against those boundaries. She stepped past them. 5 years into her career, Caitlin Clark had become more than an athlete. She was a case study. Business schools examined her brand strategy. Marketing programs broke down how she built an audience that extended beyond basketball. Athlete empowerment seminars pointed to her as a primary example of what happens when talent aligns with authenticity and leverage. The most interesting analysis came from an unexpected place. A doctoral thesis written by a sports sociology student who spent 3 years studying the Clark phenomenon. The research wasn't about shooting mechanics or scoring efficiency. It focused on institutions and how they react to disruption, on what happens when someone bypasses traditional gatekeepers, on the predictable patterns that emerge when legacy figures feel threatened by organic success. The researcher interviewed players, executives, media members, and fans. The conclusion was consistent. Every institution that tried to control Clark's rise lost influence. Every voice that attempted to minimize her became less relevant. Every effort to force her into a predetermined narrative backfired. Meanwhile, the individuals and organizations that adapted, that aligned with what was actually working, instead of what they wished would work, grew stronger. The system didn't change because it wanted to. It changed because reality demanded it. And that, more than any stat line or contract, became the lasting impact of Caitlin Clark's career. The conclusion of the research was simple, but in the modern media landscape, it carried real weight. Authenticity compounds. Institutions that resist authentic success don't just miss out on it. They speed up their own irrelevance. The thesis spread quickly through sports business and media circles, not because it revealed a secret, but because it put structure and data behind something people had already watched unfold in real time. Sue Bird appeared frequently in the analysis, not framed as a villain, but as a cautionary example, a legend who blurred the line between protecting a legacy and blocking someone else from building theirs. Someone who had the credibility, the platform, and the opportunity to serve as a bridge between generations, but instead became a barrier. When asked for comment, Bird declined. Her publicist released a short statement saying she had moved on to other endeavors and preferred to let her playing career speak for itself. The wording was careful, but the reality underneath it was clear. She hadn't moved on. She had been moved on from. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark was expanding into spaces that had once seemed unreachable, a signature shoe line that outsold every other WNBA player's footwear combined. A production company developing documentaries about athletes who disrupted their sports. A partnership with a major streaming platform focused on the next generation of basketball stars. She wasn't building this through cold corporate calculation. It was the same authenticity that had drawn people to her game in the first place. Every project shared a consistent thread, giving voice and visibility to people traditional systems tried to quiet. The audience didn't just follow her anymore, they believed in what she stood for. That bond ran deeper than celebrity. By 2027, the WNBA All-Star Game landed in Chicago and shattered records. Attendance peaked, viewership surged, the crowd blended sports with culture. Actors, musicians, tech leaders. The crossover the league had chased for decades finally arrived. Caitlin Clark captained one team. Paige Bueckers captained the other. Media outlets rushed to label it a rivalry that never truly existed. Both players shut that down immediately. In the joint press conference, a reporter asked how it felt to finally face each other under such a spotlight. Bueckers answered first, saying they already played against each other regularly, and that the real difference was the world finally paying attention to what had been happening all along. Clark followed by adding that the idea stars needed to be rivals for people to care was outdated. She said they were proof multiple stars, styles, and stories could exist together and benefit everyone. The reporter tried to push further, searching for tension. Clark cut it off. She said they weren't going to give the soundbite being chased. They were friends, they were competitors, they were both great, and they were tired of being pushed to fight over scraps when the league had room to grow if leadership thought bigger. The clip spread everywhere, not because of drama, but because it showed two of the biggest stars refusing to perform conflict for attention. It was a statement without being framed as one. The game itself delivered. Fast-paced, competitive, entertaining. Clark took home MVP honors after scoring 42 points in an exhibition setting that still felt meaningful. During the presentation, she spent most of her time praising Bueckers' performance, Aja Wilson's leadership, and the collective effort that made the weekend what it was. There was no ego, no positioning, just appreciation. After the game, Clark made a quiet decision. She invited Sue Bird to speak privately. No cameras, no audience, just the two of them away from the noise. The details of that conversation never surfaced. Neither woman addressed it publicly. People close to both said only one thing afterward. Whatever was said didn't change the past. But it allowed both of them to finally leave it there. Something shifted after that private meeting. Not reconciliation exactly, not friendship, more like understanding. An acknowledgement that they had been shaped by different eras, different pressures, and different definitions of success. That neither of them was entirely right or entirely wrong. That the battle between them had been real, but it was also finished. Holding on to it no longer served anyone. A month later, Sue Bird released a memoir covering her career, her life, and her journey through basketball. It was thoughtful, honest in parts, guarded in others. The chapter about Caitlin Clark stood out. It was unexpectedly direct. "I saw her doing everything I'd been told wasn't possible," Bird wrote. "A player succeeding by breaking rules I'd spent my career following. It challenged how I understood the game. And instead of celebrating that evolution, I resisted it. That resistance was my failure, not hers." She continued by acknowledging that Clark didn't owe her anything. Not deference, not patience, not compliance. She owed the game her best, and she gave it, even while facing resistance from people who should have supported her, including Bird herself. It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense. It was something closer to truth. When Clark was asked about the passage, her response was brief. "I appreciate the honesty," she said. "We all do what makes sense to us at the time. I don't carry anger about it. I'm just glad the truth is out there now. So the next player who faces that kind of resistance knows they're not imagining it, that it's real, that it's survivable, and that there's something better on the other side. That was it. No rehashing, no reopening wounds, just closure. And that restraint said more than any dramatic response could have. It showed how far Clark had moved beyond the conflict. Sue Bird's opinion, whether supportive or critical, no longer had any influence over her trajectory. By year 7, Clark had accomplished everything available to accomplish on the court: championships, MVPs, records that would stand for decades, Olympic gold, global recognition that extended beyond basketball. But the achievement she seemed proudest of wasn't tied to trophies. She changed the math. Young players entering the league now had agents negotiating revenue percentages. They had personal brands before their first professional game. They carried leverage previous generations couldn't imagine. And they all understood who made that possible. Not through selfishness, not through greed, but by refusing to accept that tradition was destiny. Clark proved one player could change an entire ecosystem. Not by asking permission, not by waiting her turn, but by being so consistent, so excellent, and so authentic that the system had to evolve around her. That's legacy, not points scored or games won, impressive as those are, but the doors opened, the barriers broken, and the possibilities created for people she would never meet. Years later, when another player faced institutional resistance, when someone else was told to dim their light or conform to outdated standards, there was already a blueprint. Not a path without obstacles, but proof the obstacles could be overcome. Because Clark had already done it. A decade after Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA, the league was unrecognizable. Not in the superficial way press releases describe transformation, but in structure and culture. Attendance had tripled. Media rights deals rivaled major men's leagues on a per-game basis. Players were household names. Young girls didn't say they wanted to play basketball. They said they wanted to be like Caitlin Clark or Paige Bueckers, or one of the many stars who rose in the ecosystem Clark helped unlock. The most meaningful change didn't show up in statistics. It was cultural. Players no longer entered the league apologizing for confidence. They didn't shrink themselves to fit expectations. They arrived knowing their value and building on it. At 33, Clark was still performing at an elite level, though she openly acknowledged the season would likely be her last. Not because her body failed her or her skills faded, but because she felt she'd said everything she needed to say on the court. And there were other things she wanted to build. Her foundation had expanded into 40 states. International partnerships were active. A full scholarship initiative had already sent hundreds of athletes to college who otherwise wouldn't have had the chance. But the most ambitious project had been developing quietly for years, an alternative basketball league, not designed to compete with the WNBA, but to expand opportunity. International players wanting to play in the United States outside traditional paths. Athletes returning from injuries or life disruptions. Players overlooked by conventional scouting. It was called the Open League. The announcement came during the WNBA playoffs, intentionally delayed so it wouldn't overshadow the games. The reaction was mixed. League executives were publicly supportive, privately cautious. Players were overwhelmingly enthusiastic. More opportunities meant more leverage, more platforms, and more sustainable careers. Sue Bird was asked for comment during one of her occasional media appearances. Her response surprised people. Caitlin Clark has spent her entire career expanding what's possible, she said. Why would she stop now? This is completely consistent with who she's always been. And honestly, the WNBA will benefit from it. Competition makes everyone better. It was measured, supportive, the kind of response that felt earned. The Open League was scheduled during the WNBA offseason. Contracts allowed players to participate in both. The format was fast-paced and creative without sacrificing integrity. Streaming first, built for how modern audiences consume sports. Clark didn't play in its first season. She was finishing her WNBA career, but her influence was everywhere, in the structure, in the values, in the freedom built into the system. And that, more than anything else, was her final statement. Not just changing the game, but changing who gets to play it, how, and on whose terms. It was her vision made real. Basketball without inherited constraints, without gatekeepers, without the invisible ceilings that had followed her from the moment she became too successful to comfortably contain. And it worked. Caitlin Clark's final WNBA game came in June of 2035, a championship clincher exactly as expected, 41 points, 8 three-pointers, a performance that somehow captured everything she had been across an entire career. Confident, precise, unavoidable. When the final buzzer sounded, the reaction went beyond celebration. The arena erupted not just with joy, but with recognition. Everyone understood they weren't simply watching a title being decided. They were witnessing the end of an era. Clark stood at center court and let the moment settle. Tears came not from sadness, but from weight. From everything she had carried, everything she had pushed through, everything she had built along the way. The trophy ceremony followed. Speeches, cameras, confetti. But the moment people remembered came after, when Clark asked for the microphone one last time. She spoke about entering the league a decade earlier as a rookie who only wanted to play basketball. She explained that she never planned to challenge legends or disrupt power structures. She only planned to be great at her craft. She described learning something essential along the way. When you succeed inside a system that was never built for you, when you rise despite resistance instead of because of support, you face a choice. You can make yourself smaller and fit into the space offered to you. Or you can expand the space itself. She admitted expanding came with a cost. Relationships strained, opportunities delayed, peace disrupted. There were moments she questioned whether it was worth it, whether she should have followed the rules she was handed instead of rewriting them. Then she shifted the focus forward, to the players entering the league now, the ones who no longer had to fight the same battles, the ones who arrived knowing their value, building their brands early, changing the game without asking permission. That clarity settled the question for her. Every difficult moment had been worth it. Every public clash, every time she was labeled too loud, too confident, too much. Because the fight was never just for herself. It was for what came next. The ovation lasted several minutes. Before leaving the stage, Clark addressed the next generation directly. The players who don't fit the mold, who play differently, who think differently, who dream differently. She reminded them they do not need permission to be great. They only need to be undeniable. She set the microphone down and walked off. The following day, tributes flooded social media. Players, fans, celebrities who had never cared about basketball until Clark made them care. The messages weren't just about her talent. They were about what she represented. The most meaningful response came from an unexpected place. Sue Bird posted a video. No production, no framing. Just her, seated in what appeared to be her living room, speaking directly to the camera. She acknowledged that Clark had been right about the direction of the game. She admitted the way she positioned herself against Clark had been wrong. She reflected on how protecting a version of basketball that felt safe to her had limited everyone else. She spoke about her own journey, years spent fighting for respect, fighting to prove women's basketball mattered. And when someone arrived who achieved those goals faster, who connected with audiences she could not reach, who changed the game in ways she did not fully understand, fear crept in. That fear turned into resistance. She acknowledged that Clark did more than change basketball. She exposed how many people were more invested in protecting their position than growing the game itself. She recognized that Clark demonstrated real leadership, real courage, and a more honest definition of legacy. She apologized for the resistance, for the subtle undermining, for making Clark's rise harder than it ever needed to be. She admitted Clark never needed her support to succeed, and that truth might be the most important lesson of all. The future does not wait for permission from the past. The video spread rapidly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. Unfiltered accountability without performance. Clark never responded directly. 3 days later, she posted a single image, a photo from her rookie year. She and Sue Bird sitting on a bench during a Team USA practice, neither looking at the camera, both focused on something happening off frame. The caption was simple. The game is bigger than any of us. Nothing else was needed. Years later, when historians examined the transformation of women's basketball, they all pointed to the same inflection point. Not a scoring record, not a championship, not the richest contract in league history, The moment Caitlin Clark refused to be diminished. That decision changed everything for her, for the league, for every player who followed. Gatekeepers learned they could not control organic success. Institutions learned they had to evolve or fade. Media learned audiences would choose authenticity over manufactured narratives. And an entire generation of athletes learned the most important lesson of all. Greatness does not require approval. It requires courage. Caitlin Clark had it, and the sport was never the same. This was never just a basketball story. It was a power story. A story about what happens when undeniable talent collides with systems built to control outcomes instead of reward truth. Caitlin Clark didn't win by tearing anyone down. She didn't win by shouting louder than everyone else. She won by being so consistently excellent that resistance became pointless. Every attempt to shrink her only clarified how necessary she was. Every effort to sideline her only made her impact more obvious. By the end, the system didn't evolve because it wanted to. It evolved because it had no alternative. Fans chose authenticity over politics. Sponsors chose results over reputation. Players chose empowerment over silence. And the league was forced to follow or fade. That's the real lesson. You don't dismantle broken structures with rage. You outgrow them. You make them obsolete. You force change by existing at a level they can't deny. What Caitlin Clark left behind wasn't just records or championships. She left behind leverage. She left behind permission that future players no longer need to ask for. She changed the expectations of what women's basketball could look like when excellence isn't filtered through comfort or tradition. And stories like this don't come from press releases. They don't come from highlight packages or official narratives. They come from the details people don't want you paying attention to. The power shifts, the money trails, the quiet decisions that reshape entire leagues before anyone admits what's happening. That's why this story mattered. And that's why stories like this keep surfacing. If you want the real breakdowns, the behind-the-scenes dynamics, and the moments that never make it into the polished version, Courtside Leaks is where those conversations live. Not the surface drama, but the forces underneath it. Because the game isn't just played on the court. And the truth usually shows up long before the system is ready to admit it. We've got every angle covered, every leak, every backstage twist, every moment they won't show you. Hit like, subscribe, drop a comment, and share this video. Stay locked in with Courtside Leaks, your home for the truth behind the WNBA headlines.